Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Actual Tech Media Expert Series. My name is Scott Becker. I'm from Actual Tech Media, and I'm excited to be your moderator for this special event on protecting Microsoft 365. Now, before we get to today's great content, we do have a few housekeeping items that will help you get the most out of this session. First off, we want this to be an informative event for you, so we encourage any questions in the questions box in our webinar control panel. A lot of you have been in there already saying hello, telling us where you're dialing in from, or logging in from, I should say. So we'll have team members responding to questions during the live event, but we'll also have a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the presentation where we'll discuss in greater detail some of the top questions that come in. Now, you can also let us know in that Q&A section if we can help in the unlikely event that you have a technical issue. So a browser refresh will fix most of those issues, but if that doesn't work, just let us know there in the Q&A and we'll provide further technical assistance. Now, at the end of this webinar event, we will be awarding a $250 Amazon gift card to one lucky registrant. Of course, you must be in attendance during the live event to qualify for the prize. Official terms and conditions of today's prize drawing can be found in the handout section. You just scroll to the bottom and you'll find all the terms and conditions there. Now, these expert series events are product neutral looks at pressing technology problems presented by an expert in the field, but the support of our sponsors makes it possible for us to bring you this content. So we want to give a special shout out to our sponsor. And over the next few slides, I'm going to share a message from our sponsor today, and they'll refer to links that you can also find in the handout section of your console at any time during the presentation. So as always, the handout section has a few valuable actual tech media links in it. There's a link to the Gorilla Guide Book Club, where you can get access to ATM's great printed resources on technology topics. There's also a link to the ATM Events Center, which has our calendar of upcoming events like this one. So we've got two more expert series coming up next Friday that we hope you can tune in for. But check out that ATM events calendar to see what's coming up. Now, before we get into the main presentation, a few words from our sponsor. So we are supported by Rubrik. Rubrik is a cybersecurity company with a mission to secure the world's data. Their zero trust data security helps organizations achieve business resilience against cyber attacks, malicious insiders, and operational disruptions. Rubrik Security Cloud, powered by machine learning, delivers data protection and cyber resilience in a single platform across enterprise, cloud, and SaaS applications. That platform automates policy management of data and enforcement of data security through the entire data lifecycle. They help organizations uphold data integrity, deliver data availability, continuously monitor data risks and threats, and restore businesses with their data when infrastructure is attacked. You can find out more in the link on your screen, which is also in the handout section. Okay, and with that, let's get to today's fantastic content. So it is my pleasure to introduce you to our presenter today, Brian Posey. And I'll let Brian tell you a little bit about himself later, but I'll just say here that he's probably forgotten more about Microsoft infrastructure than many experts ever knew. He's been a Microsoft MVP 21 times over and played with, deployed, and written compellingly about entire generations of Microsoft infrastructure products from on-premises to the cloud and back. He's seen Microsoft cycles of launching new products and services, supporting them, retiring them, and he understands Microsoft's deep DNA in terms of how the company prioritizes products and the life cycle of those products. All that is to say, we're in good hands over the next 40 minutes to an hour to get some really great info about protecting Microsoft 365. Brian, welcome.
Hey, thank you so much, Scott. Wow, I hope I can live up to that introduction. That was awesome. Thank you for that. So yeah, I'm not going to elaborate too much on my bio other than just to say, yes, I'm a 21-time Microsoft MVP. And I do have one other resume item that's somewhat unique in the world of IT. Since 2015, I've been actively training to fly on a commercial space mission. So with that said, let's go ahead and get into the content. So when it comes to Microsoft 365 security, one of the big questions is, where do I even begin? After all, the platform is massive and it's constantly growing. Well, the key to securing Microsoft 365 and protecting all of your resources is to focus on Microsoft's shared responsibility model. This is something that I'm sure most of you are probably familiar with, but I want to go ahead and bring it up simply because it's important, and I want to make sure that anybody who's not familiar with this model knows what the deal is. The shared responsibility model is something that, to the best of my knowledge, Microsoft created and then most of the other cloud providers ended up adopting eventually. As far as I know, nearly any cloud provider out there is going to use this model or something very similar to it. The basic idea is this. When it comes to protecting the cloud from various threats, there's a shared responsibility between the cloud provider, in this case Microsoft, and the customer. So in the case of Microsoft's shared responsibility model, the simple way to think of it is that Microsoft is responsible for the applications and the underlying infrastructure. In other words, they keep the infrastructure from being compromised, they keep the applications up and running, and they make sure that those applications are available. So that's what Microsoft does for you. Your responsibility, on the other hand, is to keep the resources and the data that you create within the Microsoft Cloud secure. So data being obvious, that's things like emails, SharePoint documents, or documents stored within SharePoint rather, things like that. Other resources can be things like identities. Those are the user accounts that you create within Azure Active Directory and other types of resources. So more or less, the general rule is that anything that you create within Microsoft 365, you're the one who's responsible for keeping those resources secure. Now, obviously, that's a tall order. That's a big responsibility. The good news is that Microsoft gives you loads of tools and recommendations to help you to achieve that goal and keep those resources secure. Now, the number of tools and resources that Microsoft gives you is huge. It can be absolutely overwhelming. There are dozens and dozens of security tools and features that you can use to lock down the Microsoft 365 cloud and protect your various resources. Now, obviously, I don't have time to go into all of those. It would probably take me a week to discuss them all, and even then, that might be tough to do. So my goal for today is to talk about 3 resources that I personally consider to be the most valuable in securing your Microsoft 365 cloud. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started. So the first resource that I want to talk about is something called Secure Score. Again, this is something that I'm sure many of you are already familiar with, but I do want to be sure and talk about this because I consider this to be the #1 resource that's available to you with regard to keeping your Microsoft 365 platform secure. For anybody who might not be familiar with Secure Score, the basic idea is that Microsoft has a tool that you can access within the Defender console, and Microsoft takes a look at all of the various security features that you've enabled or disabled, and they compute a numerical score that's presented as a percentage of total possible points. And the score is more or less a reflection of how secure or insecure your organization is. So I want to take some time and really delve into what's available with Secure Score. Now, as I do, one of the things that I want to point out is that you're going to see a little bit of inconsistency among some of these screen captures. And I'm not entirely positive what the reason is for that, but my guess is that Microsoft makes updates to the console from time to time, so there may be areas where they've done a little bit of work and they haven't quite caught up on some of the other screens. So that might be why things look a little bit different on one screen versus on another. But having said that, the differences are pretty subtle. So let's go ahead and delve into this. I'm going to enlarge the view just a little bit. Oh, I'm getting ahead of myself. So let's take a look at Secure Score. This is the screen that you'll see when you visit Secure Score for the first time. The primary feature on the screen is the Secure Score itself. In this case, the score is 32.35%. So what this means is that Microsoft has created a list of tasks that they consider to be important in securing the Microsoft 365 platform. And these tasks all have a point system associated with them. And so in this case, I've achieved 32.35% of the total possible points. Now, the really important thing to understand here is that the points that are assigned aren't necessarily equal from one task to another because, let's face it, some security tasks are a lot more important than others. So another thing that I want to point out is the top recommended actions. So here, Microsoft is actually telling you what can you do in order to make your Microsoft 365 environment more secure. That's the reason why I consider this tool to be the most important tool available for securing the Microsoft 365 cloud, is because Microsoft is actually telling you what you need to do based on what you've already done in order to improve your security. Now, in addition to the Microsoft Secure Score, there is a supplementary tool that's available to you called Identity Secure Score. And this is something that you'll find in the Azure Active Directory console, or the Microsoft Entra Admin Center, as they're calling it now. And the Identity Secure Score works very, very similar to the Secure Score. The big difference is that it focuses on your Azure Active Directory identities. In other words, those user accounts that you create in Azure Active Directory or synchronize to Azure Active Directory by using Azure AD Connect. So they assign a separate score for those identities. In this case, that secure score for identity is only 14.29%, which is a pretty terrible score, to be perfectly frank with you. The good news is this is a lab account with no real data. So here you can see what Identity Secure Score looks like. And as you can see, it's very, very similar to what we had with the basic Secure Score. And in case you're wondering how I got to this, from the Microsoft Entra Admin Center, if you look at the very bottom of the screen in the center, there is a link for Secure Score for Identity. And you just click that View Secure Score link, and it takes you to the screen right here. So there's quite a bit going on here. We have the score itself. There's also a comparison section. And this comparison compares your organization, which in this case, my organization is listed as Microsoft, even though I don't actually work for Microsoft. And then beneath that, you can see a typical 100-person company. So you can see the average score that a comparable organization manages to achieve, and then you see your score in comparison. So you know if you're doing better than a comparable company or worse than a comparable company. In this case, my Identity Secure Score is pretty bad, but I haven't actually enabled anything at this point. This is, as I mentioned, a lab account with no actual data in it. So beneath the comparison, we have all of the improvement actions. And there are a couple of items that I want to point out in the improvement actions. First of all, we have the action itself. This is just a short description of what it is that you need to do to improve your security. Next to each one of those improvement actions, you have the score impact. Now, as I mentioned, not every improvement action has the same impact on your overall security. So these actions are weighted differently. Some of these actions are going to improve your score more than other actions. So what I would recommend doing is actually clicking on the score impact column, and you'll notice that there is an up and down arrow just to the right of score impact. That means that if you click on the column header, you can sort that. And you can sort the column by which item is going to give you the most bang for your buck. In other words, which item is going to do the most to improve your overall security. Because if you simply use the default order, right now the top item on the list is use least privileged administrative roles, which, yes, admittedly, that is important, but that's only going to change your score by 1.79%. Whereas if we go a little further down on the list, we have things like require multi-factor authentication for administrators, which improves your score by almost 18%. So clearly that's a more important priority, and yet it's further down on the list. So just sort that list by score impact, and you'll see the items that are the most important rise to the top. The next column is user impact. And this is another one that's important to consider, because anytime that you make a change to security, there is the potential for that change to have an impact on your end users. So each one of these actions is categorized by its user impact. And that categorization falls into categories of low, medium, or high. Low impact is something that the user is likely not even to notice, or if they do notice it, the impact is minimal. Medium is something that the user is probably going to notice, but it's probably not something that they're going to have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. And then high is something that a user absolutely isn't going to be able to ignore. It's going to change the way that the user has to do things. And then the column on the far right is the implementation cost. A lot of these recommendations can't be done with a basic Microsoft 365 subscription. A lot of times they're going to require an Azure Active Directory Premium subscription in addition to your basic Microsoft 365 subscription. So you can get a feel for what it's going to cost to implement the suggestion based on any additional licenses that are required. Now, at the very beginning of the presentation, I mentioned that Microsoft is in the process of kind of transitioning how they do things, or at least that's the way that it appears to me. And this is one of those examples, because at one time this implementation cost was displayed on the Microsoft Secure Score screen. Remember, right now we're looking at Identity Secure Score, not Secure Score itself. And so now Microsoft displays things a little bit differently. So you'll see what that looks like in a moment. So let's go back to Microsoft Secure Score rather than Identity Secure Score. So here we are on the Secure Score screen, and I've simply done a cut and paste of a couple of items that I wanted to call out. One of the things that you'll see in Secure Score is a timeline showing how your score changes over time. Now, your score can change based on a variety of factors. Anytime that you perform an administrative action related to security, that's typically going to have some impact on your score. That can be a positive impact. If you go in and you enable a security feature, you're probably going to see your score go up. At the same time, if you go in and you weaken security, you're going to see your score go down. So it's important to periodically check on this timeline just to see where you stand and if you've done anything that has adversely impacted your security. Another thing that you can see is a breakdown by category. So Microsoft categorizes all of these administrative actions by identity, data, or apps. So you can get a feel for where you really need to do some work. So in this case, my identity secure score is only 14.29%. So clearly, if this were a real account, I would need to do some serious work securing my identities. Data, on the other hand, is 77.78%. So I'm doing pretty good there. So if I had limited resources available to me, I would probably want to prioritize most of my efforts around identity rather than focusing on additional ways to secure my data, because my data is already relatively secure. And then security related to apps falls somewhere kind of in the middle. So when you look at this timeline, you can see that there was a great big dip that occurred somewhere around the end of last month. So if this were a real environment, I might be curious what it was that caused that big dip. What did I do or another administrator in my company do that caused my secure score to suddenly take a dive? Well, you can actually drill into this timeline and you can see a historical record of the various things that have occurred. And if there's something on there that you don't understand, no problem. You can click on it to get a description. So in this case, just for the sake of demonstration, I went with the top item, and you can see that we have 8 points regressed for enable policy to block legacy authentication because that policy wasn't enabled. So in other words, 8 points were deducted because I wasn't blocking legacy authentication. So if I didn't know what that meant, I could click on the link, and then it takes me to a screen like this. So I get a nice description of what this is, why it's important, and you can even see down in the lower right corner, you can tell what this particular security action is designed to protect against. In this case, it's designed to protect against password cracking and account breach. So if I wanted to go turn this on, there's actually a button to manage this in Microsoft Azure. Incidentally, if I wasn't quite sure that I wanted to enable this just yet, there's also an implementation tab at the top of the screen, so I could click on that and get instructions on how to implement this. So let's go back to the recommended actions list. Now, I mentioned that Microsoft's in the process of kind of switching things up a little bit, and that in the case of Identity Secure Score, they show you the user impact and the cost. And that's the way that they used to do things on Secure Score. But now Microsoft's kind of in a transition period, or so it would appear, and they've kind of displayed the information a little bit differently than they did before. So you can see the score impact just like you could on the other screen that I showed you. You also see the number of points that you achieve, because sometimes when you enable a security feature, it's not necessarily that the security feature is fully enabled or not enabled at all. There may be a gray area in between where it's partially enabled. So you're getting a partial benefit from the security feature, but you're not using it to its full potential. So that's why there's a points achieved column, because sometimes you might enable a feature in a way that gets you a few points, but not all of the possible points. Then skipping ahead to the right, you'll notice the third column from the right, there it is have license, and this is simply a yes, no. So before, what we had was a cost to implement column. So you could see if there was a cost associated with it based on supplementary license requirements. In this case, what Microsoft's doing is they're simply showing you, do you currently have the license that's needed in order to implement this recommendation? And then we have the category, which I showed you earlier. My organization needed some work done with regard to identity and with regard to apps, but data looked pretty good. So here you can see these various actions categorized by identity, apps, and data. So let's take a deeper look at one of these recommendations. I went ahead and clicked on it, and this one was require multi-factor authentication for administrative roles. And what we can see is a general description of this particular recommendation, why it's important. And as before, there's an implementation tab that you can click on to get instructions on how to how to enable this particular feature. There's also a edit status and action plan link at the top and a manage tags link. And there's a button that you can click to manage this in Microsoft Azure. So here's what the implementation screen looks like. You have actual step-by-step instructions that you can follow to implement this particular security feature. And then each one of these steps contains links that you can click on to go to documentation, where you can get more detailed instructions should you need them. Now, I mentioned a moment ago that there was a link at the top of the screen, and you can see the green arrow pointing to that link to edit the status plan and action plan. And the reason why I wanted to show you this is because unless you're in an extremely small organization and you're the only administrator, typically you're not going to want to just go in and start enabling security features without telling anybody. That's typically going to cause some unanticipated consequences. Maybe at the very least you cause some confusion, but you may also step on other administrators' toes or things like that. So rather than just going in and implementing these right away, what you can do is you can click on this edit status and action plan and then provide some information about what you've decided to do about this particular risk. So the default status and action plan is to address. So in other words, this is something that needs to be addressed. But you can also set this to planned. So if you've had a discussion with the people involved in your organization and you know this is something that you want to do, but it just hasn't been done yet, you can click on planned just to show that this is something that we've talked about, we're ready to go with this, we just haven't done it yet. There's also risk accepted, because you may not always want to go for a perfect score. There might be some of these security mechanisms that for whatever reason you just don't want to implement. Maybe it's just not right for your organization, or you have a third-party mechanism that does a better job, so you're not going to implement it at the Microsoft side or something like that. So you can choose to accept the risk rather than implement this particular security feature. There are also options for resolve through third party or resolve through alternate mitigation. Resolve through alternate mitigation. What this is that sometimes Microsoft will give you multiple tools to do a job. For example, if you were to go out and set up a brand new Microsoft 365 account today, Microsoft is going to enable something called security defaults. And security defaults will help your user accounts to be more secure. It enables multi-factor authentication and things like that. But there's actually a recommendation that if you have access to conditional access policies, which is something I'm going to talk about later on and requires an Azure Active Directory Premium P1 subscription, that it's better to use conditional access policies than the security defaults. So this is one of those examples of a feature that's resolved through an alternate mechanism. So if the recommendation is to enable the security defaults, but you're using conditional access policies instead, then you might mark resolve through alternate mitigation. So that's what that exists for. So here we are back at the main Microsoft Secure Score screen. And if you look at the big green arrow, you can see that the status for this particular item has been changed to planned. So this is where those changes that I showed you on the previous slide show up as you make them. So a few key takeaways is that Secure Score is designed to identify security deficiencies that Microsoft considers to be the most important. But going after a perfect score probably isn't going to be realistic. I've yet to see a real-world organization achieve a perfect score. And the reason for that is that you have to balance security with usability. I've got a friend who used to always say that if you really want to make your data secure, write it all to a removable hard drive, take that hard drive, put it in a safe, and then drop that safe to the bottom of the ocean. At that point, yeah, it's secure. Nobody can get to that data. But it's also not usable either. So you have to balance that usability with the need for security. And so there may be certain security mechanisms that you don't want to implement simply because of that need for usability. So make sure and strike a healthy balance between security and usability. So let's move on to the second item that I wanted to talk about, and that's conditional access policies. I alluded to this one just a little bit earlier. Conditional access policies are essentially if-then statements for security. They allow you to create policies to deal with various conditions that happen in your organization. And as I mentioned, you're going to need an Azure AD Premium P1 license if you want to use conditional access policies. So let's take a quick look at how conditional access policies work. Conditional access policies are based on the idea that granting access to a resource isn't quite as cut and dry as it used to be. I mean, if you think about the way that we've always done things in the past, we had a resource, we set up an access control list of who should have access to that resource, and anybody who successfully authenticated and appeared on that access control list was given access to the resource anytime they logged in. Simple. The problem with that is that things aren't quite as simple as they used to be. We have all of these different conditions that we may want to look at, and it's not always in our best interest to allow a user to access a resource that you've given them access to. Let me give you an example. Let's suppose that you've got a particular user who comes into the office every day, and at 9 a.m. they open up a particular application. Well, that's a very recognizable pattern, and there's nothing suspicious at all about that. The user is adhering to their normal behavior. But let's say that that same user logs on from a rogue country on the other side of the world. I'll let you use your imagination about what country that might be. And they attempt to access that same app at 3 o'clock in the morning from that foreign country. Well, that might be something that you want to pay attention to. Now, with the old way of doing things, that user would automatically be given access to that application when they logged into it. Because the access control list says, yes, this user who is successfully authenticated has access to this application. Conditional access policies let you look at other things. So you can look at, yes, the access control list says this person should be able to access this application, but their location suggests that maybe this isn't who they claim to be. Maybe these credentials have been stolen and it's not in my best interest to allow access to this application. So that's sort of the thought process behind conditional access policies. So let's take a look at how these work. This is the screen that you'll see when you access conditional access policies. And as you can see, I got there through the Microsoft Entra Admin Center. I'll go ahead and zoom in just a little bit. So here's an example of some conditional access policies. So the first one on the list is when any user is outside the company network, that's the condition. The control is they're required to sign in with multi-factor authentication. So remember what I said, conditional access policies work a lot like if-then statements. So in this case, the if is if any user is outside the company network, and the then is they're required to sign in with multi-factor authentication. The next example on the list is if a user is in the managers group sign-in, the then is they're required to be on an Intune compliant or domain joined device. So in other words, we're assigning conditions based on, we're assigning controls based on the conditions that have been detected. Now, the nice thing about conditional access policies is that they're really simple to set up. So when you create when you click on the Create Conditional Access Policy link, you're taken to a screen kind of like what you see on the left. So the first step is to provide a name for the policy. Nothing overly complicated there. Just be sure to use something descriptive. Next, you assign this conditional access policy to whoever you want it to apply to. You can assign it to individual users or you can assign it to groups. As a best practice, you should only assign it to groups because that's going to be a lot easier to manage. The next thing that you have to do is designate the target resource. And the three boxes that you see on the right side of the screen show the types of resources that you can apply this conditional policy to. So you can apply it to cloud apps, user actions, or authentication contexts. And in case you're wondering, authentication contexts are used to secure application data for things like SharePoint or Outlook or things like that. So the next step is to begin setting up a condition. And because of time, I'm not going to go into these in any great depth. I've already shown you a couple of examples of conditions, but some of the conditions that you can set up are user risk or sign-in risk. So if you deem a sign-in to be particularly risky, or if you deem a particular user to be especially risky, you can take action based on that. You can also take action based on device platform. So if a user signed in from a domain joined corporate PC, that's one thing. But if they're signed in from a jailbroken iPhone, that's a completely different thing. And maybe you want to take that into consideration when deciding whether or not to allow access to a resource. Another thing that you can look at is location. I talked about this one earlier. a user signs in unexpectedly from another country on the other side of the world. So you can take location into consideration when deciding whether or not to grant access to a resource. And incidentally, I'm going to show you one particular aspect of location in a few slides. Then we have things like client apps. In other words, a user's trying to access data. What app are they using to get to that data? In the case of email, for example, is that user using Outlook, or are they using some third-party mail client that we don't necessarily trust? And then we have filter for devices. So once you've set the condition, the next thing that you do is choose whether or not you want to allow access. So in the past, as I mentioned with access control list, we could grant access or we could deny access. In this case, we can still do that, but we can add conditions. So maybe we want to grant access, but we're also going to require multi-factor authentication, or we're going to require the user to use a particular strength of authentication. So we have all of these checkboxes that we can select to control what conditions we want to enable for allowing access to this particular resource based on the condition that we've specified. There are also some session controls that we can set. And I'm not going to get into these too heavily because I'm quickly running out of time and there's still a lot that I want to get to. But the idea here is that you can take action based on the user's session. For example, I've hovered over sign-in frequency. And I'm sure you've seen the pop-ups in the Edge browser when you go into Microsoft Office like, hey, do you want to stay signed in? Well, here you can say, okay, this user's stayed signed in for 90 days. Let's go ahead and re-authenticate them just because they've been signed in for so long. Now, I mentioned that there was something else related to locations that I wanted to show you. And what that is that you can create named locations. So for example, if your corporate office uses a particular IP address range, you can set that up as a known location, and you can build conditional access policies based on that known location. Now, something else that I wanted to point out before we move on to the third feature that I wanted to talk about is that you have the ability now to create a conditional access policy from templates. This is something brand new. It's something that's currently in preview. But the basic idea is that Microsoft knows that setting up a conditional access policy can be a lot of work. So they've tried to make things a little bit easier for you by providing pre-built templates that you can use in place of manually creating a policy. So you'll notice along the menu bar at the top, there is new policy from template. If you click on that, then you're taken to a screen like this where you can simply choose the template that you want to use. And right now I've got the All tab selected so you can see all of the available templates, or all the ones that'll fit on the screen anyway. There are quite a few. But templates are categorized by secure foundation, zero trust, remote work, protect the administrator, emerging threats, and that sort of thing. So if you want to see the templates related to zero trust, well, just select the zero trust tab and there will be a handful of templates that are displayed. And you can use those templates to quickly create the conditional access policies that would be valuable in a zero trust environment. Now, one thing that I wanted to quickly point out about these templates is there's a link to download a JSON file related to that template. The nice thing about this link is that you can download the JSON file, and this gives you the ability to see the structure of these templates and of the conditional access policies that they're designed to create. So presumably Microsoft is going to give you the ability to create your own custom policies based on these JSON files. So the third security feature that I wanted to talk about is attack simulation training. The idea is there's an old saying that a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. And when it comes to security, I've often suggested that users are typically the weakest link in the security chain. Because no matter how good your security might be, all it really takes is a user clicking on something that they shouldn't to cause a problem for you. So that's where attack simulation training comes into play. The idea being that phishing attacks are one of the most pervasive threats against any organization. So rather than just waiting for your user to fall for a phishing attack, you can actually launch your own phishing attacks against your users so that they get used to phishing emails and are less likely to fall for a real attack. Incidentally, attack simulation training is included with Microsoft 365 E5 subscriptions, but there is one sample attack that comes with the E3 subscription. So how does this work and what should you be doing with it? Well, the basic idea is that you set up this fake phishing attack against your users, and Then you keep track of who has clicked on the link and fallen for the phishing attack. Now, rather than hauling that user off to HR or doing something drastic, the idea is that you can enroll them in training and teach them how to recognize a phishing email so that they're less likely to fall for this in the future. And these training sessions are designed to be really short. They're about 3 minutes each. But the idea being that if the users begin to know that you're sending out fake phishing messages and that they're going to have to sit through this mandatory training every time they fall for one, they're not going to want to have to endure this training over and over again. So they're going to start being a lot more vigilant about looking for phishing messages simply because they know you're sending out fake ones and that if they fall for it, there's consequences. So they're going to be a lot more hesitant to click on something that they shouldn't. The key there is that in order to make that happen, you're going to need to send out these fake phishing attacks on a pretty regular basis. So let's take a look at what this looks like. So you access the attack simulation training through the Microsoft 365 Defender console. You can see what that looks like right here. There's a quick video you can watch to gain instructions and get a feel for how this works. And there's a button you can click to launch an instant simulation or to launch your own simulation. When you launch a simulation, you're taken to a screen like this. The first thing that you have to do is pick the type of attack that you want to launch. So I've selected credential harvest, but there are other types of attacks, things like malware attachments, links and attachments, links to malware, drive-by URL, and so on. There are more that won't fit on the screen. So Microsoft gives you quite a few different types of attacks to choose from. The next thing that you have to do is enter a name for the simulation that you're setting up and an optional description. Then you have to choose the payload that you want to include in the attack. The payload is essentially just the phishing message that gets sent out to your users. And there are 3 colored arrows on the screen marking 3 things that I want to quickly point out. The orange arrow points to 189 items. So remember, we've already selected the type of attack that we want to perform. In this case, it's a credential harvesting attack. So we have 189 different types of credential harvesting attacks that we can launch. So you don't have to worry about the users just knowing that a particular message is from you because they've seen it before. You've got a huge variety of messages that you can choose from as a way of keeping your users on their toes. The purple arrow points to a create a payload button. So you can actually create your own custom attacks. You're not necessarily limited to using the attacks that Microsoft has created. And then the green arrow points to a column for predictable compromised. The idea being that in the real world, some attacks are a whole lot more obvious than others. We've all seen phishing attack attempts that are absolutely laughable. Anybody with half a brain would recognize that this isn't a legitimate message. So Microsoft has included messages like that among the payload library, but they've also provided other payloads that are designed to be more convincing. And you can use this predicted compromise metric to see how convincing a particular attack is designed to be and what percentage of your users Microsoft is estimating are going to fall for this particular attack. So once you've chosen a payload, you get a preview of what that payload looks like. You can see what that looks like right here. And you also have the ability to send a test message so that you can see a message in your own inbox of what this particular attack is going to look like. So that way you can recognize it when it happens. You also have the chance to make changes if there's anything in there that you don't like. And incidentally, you'll notice the orange arrow on the screen. This is something that I forgot to point out on one of the earlier slides. Microsoft provides a search box. So if there's a particular type of attack that you're really interested in launching against your users, you can search for it within the library rather than having to manually sift through hundreds of different attack types. So then you choose who you want to direct the attack against. You can do it against everybody in the entire organization, and that includes you, or you can direct it at specific users or groups. Then you come to the screen where you're able to assign training to the users who have fallen for the attack. So you can select the training courses yourself, or you can let Microsoft do the assignments. And if you choose to let Microsoft do it, they'll pick out the most relevant training experiences. You also have the option of doing no training, which I don't recommend, but you can do it. Or you can redirect users to a custom URL. So if you've set up your own training courses, you can do that in response to users who have fallen for your phishing attack. Then you have the ability to choose the landing page that you want to use. The Microsoft defaults usually work fine, but you can also set up a custom URL if you prefer. And then you set up end user notifications. Again, you can use the Microsoft defaults, or you can customize things based on your own preferences. Then you choose when you want to launch this particular attack. So you can launch it as soon as you're done, or you can set it to launch at a particular date. Then there's also a field for configuring the number of days to end the simulation. The basic idea is that only so many people are going to fall for your attack. So there's going to be a period at which everybody's just forgotten about it. The ones who aren't going to fall for it either didn't click on it or they deleted the message and moved on. So it's important to set a date to end the attack. 2 days is the default, but you can go longer or shorter based on your own needs. So then you're taken to a review screen where you can see all of the options that you've chosen. There's also one last opportunity to send a test. And then if you're satisfied with everything, you can go ahead and begin the attack. So here's what the phishing message looks like when it shows up in somebody's mailbox. So you can see the phishing message, but what I thought was interesting is that Microsoft even includes the external mail notification with instructions. Do not click any links or open any attachments unless you trust the sender. So if somebody falls for this phishing attack in spite of this particular warning, then it's a pretty good indication that yes, they do need some training. So what happens if somebody clicks on the link? Well, it's going to vary based on the type of attack that you've set up, but in this case, remember, we're doing a credential harvesting attack. So the user clicks on the link and they're taken to a screen asking for their Microsoft 365 credentials. Now, a user should know at this point that they're going to fair price online, but yet it's asking for Microsoft 365 credentials. They should know that that's a scam. But if a user does go ahead and enter those credentials, then they're taken to this screen right here saying, you were just phished by your security team. It's okay, you're human. Let's learn from this. And then if you scroll down through the list, there are some tips to identify this as a as a phishing message. So the user can see what it was that they should have picked up on within this message that would allow them to recognize it as fraudulent. And if the user scrolls down further on the screen, there's a button that they can click to go to training. So what if the user were to just ignore this and, hey, I never saw that there was something to go to training? Well, no problem, because there are going to be messages that get delivered to their inbox with instructions to take them to the training that you've set up. So when they click on that link, they're taken to their training assignments. In this case, there are 2 particular training assignments. And when they go through the training, it's meant to be fun and not too overly serious. It's done in cartoon style. So the cartoons present a scenario, and then they'll stop ever so often and ask the user a question based on whatever's happened in the cartoon. You can see an example of that right here. Now, on the administrative side, what you see is a report like this for the campaign that you set up. Because remember, you can create multiple phishing attacks. So you've got a screen like this separate for each one of the attacks that you've set up. So you can see the number of messages that were delivered, how many of those messages were successfully received, and then you can see how many users were compromised. In other words, who fell for the attack. There's actually a link that you can click to view the compromised users. There's also a link that you can click on to see who reported this message as a phishing attack. And then you can also see how many users were enrolled in training and how much of that training has been completed. So you can get a feel for your users' behavior, and you can watch that behavior hopefully change over time as you launch more and more of these fake phishing attacks against your users. So with that said, I'm about out of time, but I want to go ahead and turn it back over to Scott in case there were any questions or answers that need to be taken care of.
Yeah, absolutely. So great walkthrough, Brian. Appreciate all the screen shares. That made it really easy to visualize how exactly these tools work. And so just to recap, you were saying start with a secure score, then move on to conditional access policies if you've got the licensing for that, and finally leverage the attack simulation training if you've got that licensing too. So my first question here, you mentioned some of the licensing limitations, but is Secure Score available to any customer of any Microsoft 365 license level?
As far as I know, if you've got a business level subscription as opposed to a consumer grade subscription, so if you've got Microsoft 365 Business or Enterprise, then yes, you should have access to that Secure Score. It's possible that Microsoft has some limitations on this, but I'm not aware of any. So I
Okay.
believe that everybody gets that.
Okay. No, super. That makes a lot of sense. There was a question from Jeffrey who was wondering, can the public see our security score? If they do it through Microsoft.
No, they can't. There is that metric that I showed you about the average score achieved by comparable companies. Your score is probably factoring into that average. But no, there's no way that the public can go in and say, oh, this particular organization only scored 17%. They're a good target for attack. It doesn't work like that.
Okay. All right. Um, let's see. On the conditional access policies, you mentioned that that requires an Azure AD Premium P1 license. I've kind of lost track on the licensing. Is that one that's pretty common for Microsoft 365 customers, or is that a big step up for most organizations?
Yeah, especially when you start getting into the enterprise E3, E5, most of the organizations that have those enterprise grade subscriptions go ahead and get at least the Azure Premium P1 license. P2 is really the one that's kind of the bigger step up that fewer people have.
Okay. All right, great. Yeah, and it sounds like, from what you were describing and some of the things you were saying, it can really help with, a zero trust policy, implementing a zero trust policy to be using that CAP stuff.
Yeah, the Premium P1 license, it's an extra cost. I get that, but if your organization has the budget, it's one of those things that's probably worthwhile to go ahead and do just because there are so many things that you get with that license.
Gotcha. Yeah, and nice tip on the JSON file downloads, by the way. Thanks for that. Let's see. We have a question from Jeffrey, who's wondering what are some good resources for secure score and conditional access policy. Anything you can recommend?
Uh, there are countless resources out there. It really depends on what you're looking for. If you're looking for the official Microsoft documentation, that's at learn.microsoft.com. They've got all the details about everything you could ever possibly want to know about those out there. If you're looking for something a little bit easier to digest, my suggestion would be to go out to YouTube, and there's a lot of video walkthroughs out there. So that might be something helpful to you. And then, of course, if Microsoft goes back to having their conferences in person, such as Ignite, they typically do hands-on labs at those conferences, and there are almost always sessions on conditional access policies. So you can do like the self-paced walkthrough using the Microsoft official curriculum and gain hands-on experience that way.
Okay. All right. Super. Thank you. One thing that you mentioned there is that there's a sample attack with the E3 subscription. As far as the simulation, the attack simulation training. And I was wondering if that's something that you've played around with. Is that sort of like a teaser of the capability that you get if you had the E5 license, or is it a pretty robust, useful sample?
No, it's very, very similar to what you get with the E5 license. The only difference is that they give you one payload as opposed to giving you hundreds of payloads.
Oh,
So
wow.
yes, it's something that I've definitely played around with. For my own organization, the Microsoft 365 account that I use day in, day out, that's just an E3. The one that I used for this presentation was a lab-based E5 account. And so I've seen both of them, and they're very similar to one another.
Okay. Norman has a question. I guess this would apply to the E5 version. Wondering, can this tool send a SQL injection attack?
As far as I know, no. I haven't seen that capability built into it. It'd be really interesting if Microsoft adds that capability in the future.
Okay. One of the things too, like the E5 license, it's so much more expensive than the E3. I think the list price is like, I was just poking around while you were talking, like $21 more per user per month. $57 versus 36. On the other hand, there is the attack simulation training in the Microsoft Defender for Office 365 Plan 2, which is listed at $5 per user per month. I don't know. I don't know if you know either. Is that the same as the E5 version?
I believe that it is. there are quite a few capabilities like that Microsoft makes, where you can just add it on as an ancillary subscription rather than going to the full E5.
Yeah,
The thing is, once you get a few of those ancillary add-ons, it can be just as expensive, if not more so, than if you had just gone ahead and gotten the E5 subscription.
sure. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Um, and I guess, how much worse have you seen, like, the phishing getting worse lately with ChatGPT in terms of being, looking more like, English as a first language, with some of those generative AI capabilities?
Yeah, I have actually. I've received a couple of phishing messages personally over the last couple of days that looked completely authentic. So the attackers are definitely stepping up their game. And then there was one attack that I saw maybe 2 or 3 months ago that was so unique that I'll go ahead and mention it, even though this attack was completely despicable. Um, what this particular person did is they went out and they found a real obituary from someone. It was an older one, but they found one. And they turned that into a phishing email. They just changed the click here for flowers link into a link to a malicious site. And they blasted this out using the subject line condolences, and had this, and hey, for more details or to send flowers, click here. And I have to wonder how many people fell for that because they picked a really common name associated with this.
Huh. Oh, that's nasty.
Yeah.
um, Hey, here's a question from Paul, who's wondering how robust Microsoft's attack simulation training is when matched up versus third-party solutions.
Honestly, I'm not sure how to answer that, because I know that there are third-party solutions out there. I recently talked to somebody about one of those, but I haven't had the chance to try any of those out for myself. So I couldn't tell you how Microsoft's solution measures up to one of the third-party ones.
Okay. All right, super. Um, I'm just scanning through. We did have a lot of questions come in. Thanks everybody for all the questions. And just taking a quick check. Okay, I think we hit most of them. Brian, this has been fantastic. As always, really appreciate you coming on and sharing all your Microsoft expertise with us. This has been a great presentation. I've learned a lot, and I think the audience has as well. So thank you.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Okay, yeah, and thanks everybody for all of your questions. And you may have noticed in the questions area, somebody asked, and I apologize, I forget who, if this would be available again, and it will be within like 24 to 48 hours. You'll get an email with a link to a rebroadcast of the event. So if you want to come back and look through for any of those specific screen shares or anything, you'll have that opportunity, because there were so many great points and wizards shown and things like that. So keep an eye out for that email. And before we wrap, we have one more piece of business. It's the Amazon gift card prize drawing. And the winner of the $250 Amazon gift card is Ross Comstock from Michigan. So congratulations to Ross. We'll be in touch to get you your card. And with that, on behalf of the Actual Tech Media team, I want to thank our sponsors at Rubrik for making this event possible. And of course, thanks again to Brian for a great presentation. And thanks to all of you for attending and for all of your great questions here in the Q&A portion. Really appreciate those questions. So that concludes today's event. Have a fantastic weekend, and we hope to see you next time.